To support us in providing more, subscribe to the channel now. My family owns a small cabin on the outskirts of a quiet town in North Carolina, an old place that holds many memories within its walls. This cabin, considered a family heirloom, has a special value in our hearts. We are all hesitant to part with it, not only because it represents our family history, but also because it carries a captivating story linked to it. A story that might intrigue any neutral observer, but was undoubtedly terrifying for my grandmother who lived through that experience. It was the summer of 1988, a year before I was born. At that time, my grandmother spent her days in the cabin alone, as my grandfather had passed away before I was born. However, they used to visit this place together every summer. My grandparents would use this cabin as a retreat from the hustle and bustle of urban life, spending 2 whole weeks away from everything, with only the squirrels as their companions. But after my grandfather's death, my grandmother decided to keep this tradition alive and continued going there alone as a way to cope with her grief. In June 1988, my grandmother set off for the cabin by herself for the first time. Without a companion, there was no television, but she had an old radio to listen to a station that was my grandfather's favorite. The station, like most of its kind, interspersed short news segments, and one day, my grandmother heard reports of a series of terrorist bombings occurring in Georgia and Alabama, resulting in many injuries. The police had already identified a suspect they wanted to question, but the man had gone into hiding, with suspicions that he was hiding in the hills of North Carolina. The reporter describing the suspect painted a picture of a dangerous individual. He was of average height, with dark hair and light eyes, and the man's name was Klaus Belmont. My grandmother couldn't forget this name. It resonated with her memories of a Christmas song about Santa Claus, and even though singing it in midsummer was considered bad luck, she found herself whistling the tune around the cabin. Hours passed as she enjoyed country songs and one of her favorite romantic shows, and she began to forget the news of the bombings. As the sun set, while she was relaxing and reading a book on the old couch that still resides in the cabin, she heard a knock on the door. This struck her as very odd since she wasn't expecting any visitors. Her only neighbors lived nearly a mile away. A sense of fear gripped her, but she rose and walked to the front door. Upon opening it, she found a man of average height, with light eyes, a dark mustache, and a striking cowboy hat. Being a kind-hearted soul, she welcomed him and said, "Good evening," asking how she could assist him. The man began, "Good evening, ma'am. I apologize for bothering you, but I have a small request." He asked if she had any food to spare, explaining that he also owned a cabin in the area, but had forgotten to bring food along. Leaving him without anything to eat for him, he asked if she had any food to spare, explaining that he also owned a cabin in the area, but had forgotten to bring food along, leaving him without anything to eat for the night. My grandmother sensed something was off. The man seemed too cunning. Despite her reservations, she invited him inside. Of course, my grandmother kept a pantry stocked with all sorts of canned and dried foods, so she filled the man's backpack with supplies. However, in a moment of hesitation, she lifted her gaze and asked for his name. Her instinct kicked in when he told her his name was Claire. When she asked for his last name, for an inexplicable reason, he revealed his real last name, Belmont. This last name triggered alarm bells in her mind, and while she wasn't entirely sure why, it was enough to make her stomach drop. In a time before cell phones, and with no landline in the cabin, her only means of communicating with the outside world was shouting, something that would hardly reach anyone a mile away. My grandmother recalled that at that moment, fear began to creep in. Realizing she had no real way to defend herself beyond an old flare gun, she understood that if the situation was as dire as she suspected, the flare gun wouldn't suffice against a stranger. Instead, she decided to play it cool and navigate the situation carefully. She thought that if she acted foolishly and offered him more food, allowing him to stay, he might not become aggressive. If she was lucky enough to survive the night, she could drive to town in the morning and inform the police that the man they were looking for had stopped by the cabin. Just as she was about to politely ask him to leave, he said something that changed everything and sent chills down her spine. "Actually, I have one more small request. Is there a place in this cabin where I could rest and sleep for the night?" My grandmother recalls that there was a tense silence as she looked at the man face to face, seeing a mix of desperation and malice in his eyes. Trying to remain calm, she said, "I'm sorry, but I don't have a spare room." In response, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a gun, and said, "I'm so sorry. I was hoping you wouldn't say that." He then pointed to the gun and added, "Don't make me use this." For anyone still oblivious, the man at her door was not Claire Belmont or any fake name he concocted. He was Klaus Belmont himself, the terrorist responsible for many deaths. My grandmother stated that this was undoubtedly the most terrifying moment of her life, but not for the reasons one might assume. She was not afraid of dying at the hands of this man. At around 70 years old at that time, she believed she had already settled her affairs with God long ago. What truly frightened her was the normality of this strange man. Even after he removed his mask and revealed his true face, he remained polite and friendly toward her, even offering to help with chores in the morning. Naturally, she told him that she could manage just fine on her own, and certainly didn't want the FBI to think she was consenting to his stay. But he didn't seem like the crazy person she had imagined. After hearing the news report, my grandmother noted that the only time he truly revealed a glimpse of who he was, or what he had done, was when they said grace before dinner. She couldn't recall his exact words, but it was something like, "In the end, the righteous will prevail." Here was a man who had literally killed hundreds of people and attempted to kill hundreds more in a series of horrific bombings. So, she simply couldn't process the reality that he was referring to himself as one of the righteous, which horrified her more than many things in the world had up until that night. My grandmother felt as if she was face to face with a flesh and blood devil, and just the thought of sharing a table with him made her stomach churn, so it was no surprise that she barely touched her food. After dinner, she retreated to her bedroom while Klaus took the old couch. Lying in her room, she couldn't close her eyes, anticipating an explosion at any moment that could shatter her life. As midnight approached, she began to hear the sound of helicopters, and suddenly, the entire cabin was illuminated. A bright white light shone down, and then she realized it was a helicopter. At that moment, she thought it was only a matter of moments before a team of FBI agents would storm the cabin, but she didn't want to leave her room. She waited for several moments as the sound of the helicopter roared overhead, but no one entered the house. Instead, at some point, the helicopter simply flew away. She must have dozed off eventually because the next time she awoke, the cabin was fully lit, but this time not by helicopter lights, but by the morning sun. She got up and wandered around the cabin, but there was no sign of Klaus, as if all of it had been part of a dream, as if he had never truly existed. But then she found a handwritten note on the table that read, "Thanked you for your hospitality. God bless you." There was no doubt in her mind that it had all been real, and that the helicopter she saw that night had indeed come for him. My grandmother would later express that if she had been a young woman, he might have truly harmed her. But being an elderly woman, she posed no real threat to him. Moreover, she knew very well that the little cabin had no phone line or any means to report an intruder to anyone. Yet, my grandmother always emphasized that what was truly frightening about this experience wasn't that he could have harmed her, as her intuition somehow told her he wouldn't, but that this man was entirely normal and polite. There was no difference between him and anyone else we might consider harmless and decent. This was likely one of the most important lessons my grandmother left us through this experience. Sometimes the real monsters aren't terrifying creatures that emanate evil upon being looked at. In some cases, they could be, but often, the most vile and wicked monsters hide behind a harmless facade and polite demeanor. Thus, we should not trust someone solely based on their appearance. My name is Adele, and the story I'm about to tell you happened when I was 15 years old. At that time, I was living in a very remote town with a population of fewer than 300 people. Before that, I lived in a small apartment in the city center with my mother, where I spent most of my life. However, due to financial difficulties we faced, we moved to this small town on the outskirts of the city, to a house owned by a friend of my mother. This was the first time I lived in such a place, and I must say I hated everything about it. The house was surrounded by a church, a cemetery, and an old abandoned school. You can imagine how thrilled I was to have all these eerie places around me, each one scarier than the other. The abandoned school was the closest building to us, about 20 to 30 meters from the house. Now, I can tell you that I have a whole collection of terrifying stories about that place. Enough to write a whole book about my experiences there. From the laughter of children I heard at midnight to the sleep paralysis episodes I experienced, which I had never encountered before. However, the story I'm about to tell you revolves around something far more horrifying. In that town, there was no internet, which was a complete nightmare for me since I had come from a big city. Before the move, I enjoyed spending most of my time watching videos on YouTube and playing online games. I wasn't very social, but after settling in that remote town, far from any technology, I had no choice but to entertain myself with the few games still installed on my computer, or watch the same 10 movies on a DVD over and over again. One night, it was around 3 in the morning, and everyone had gone to bed by that time. However, I stayed up playing an old game on my computer. I wore my headphones the entire time, so I couldn't hear any outside noises. But at one point, I paused the game because I thought I heard a rustling of leaves coming from the garden near my window. I took off my headphones and went to the window. leaning out to take a look, but I didn't see anything. My room was on the second floor of the house, above the kitchen, which was also connected to the door leading to the back porch. After hearing the rustling, an eerie silence fell, and I felt a surge of tension building within me. But soon that silence was shattered by the frenzied barking of our dogs echoing throughout the house. Upon hearing that, I ran down the stairs to find my mother and her husband, who were in the basement, meaning I had to pass through the kitchen to reach them. When I reached the bottom of the stairs near the kitchen, I started to hear knocking and shouting to my right, where the door to the back porch was, and that was where the dogs were barking. At that moment, I felt frozen in place. I was completely paralyzed by fear. I took off my headphones and went to the window, leaning out to take a look, but I didn't see anything. My room was on the second floor of the house, above the kitchen, which was also connected to the door leading to the back porch. After hearing the rustling, an eerie silence fell, and I felt a surge of tension building within me. But soon that silence was shattered by the frenzied barking of our dogs echoing throughout the house. Upon hearing that, I ran down the stairs to find my mother and her husband, who were in the basement, meaning I had to pass through the kitchen to reach them. When I reached the bottom of the stairs near the kitchen, I started to hear knocking and shouting to my right, where the door to the back porch was, and that was where the dogs were barking. At that moment, I felt frozen in place. I was completely paralyzed by fear. Then my stepfather emerged from the basement, and when he heard the commotion, he headed toward the back door. That's when things started to get strange. We looked through the small window in the door and saw a strange man standing on the back porch, covered in blood. I swear this was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. That man looked like a nightmare, drenched in blood from head to toe, yet he didn't seem injured. Instead, he looked incredibly desperate. He started mumbling in a frantic voice, saying he was being chased by a group of people and that they had shot him. At that moment, the man began to plead with us to let him in to hide and use our phone. My stepfather told him to stay away from the door and show him where he was injured. But as he did so, the man quickly changed his story, now saying that the blood wasn't his, but that of his friends. The tension escalated further, and when we closed the door, the man started pounding on it frantically, screaming to be let in. As he did that, his tone shifted from pleading to threatening, and he began kicking the door, threatening to kill my stepfather. While he continued to threaten, he warned my stepfather that he would call the police if we didn't let him in. Amid all this chaos, my heart was racing so hard that I felt it might explode from my chest at any moment. In that moment, my stepfather told me to grab the phone and call the police immediately. While I was on the phone with the police, I saw my mother rush to her room and then come back upstairs carrying my stepfather's gun, placing it in his hands. The man continued to pound on the door irrationally while he screamed threats. That moment turned into a painful waiting game. As I was on the line with the police, counting the minutes until they arrived, while the man kept banging on the door, trying to get in at all costs. At one point, he started screaming in a painful way, as if he were terrified, saying that the men were coming and that they were surrounding our house with their weapons and would start shooting. By that time, my stepfather had turned off all the lights in the house so that no one could see us. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, the sirens began to approach us. My stepfather made me look out the window to alert them when they arrived, while I was in a state of panic. Then, I saw the blue and red lights stop in front of our house, and when I confirmed their arrival, I turned on the lights and waved to get their attention through the window. When the police arrived, they ordered the man to come out from the porch with his hands raised and lie on the ground. Fortunately, the man complied and didn't resist arrest, and the police took him to the station. After this incident, I couldn't return to sleep for the rest of the night. In the end, we found out that the man had originally tried to break into our basement, where my mother and her husband's room was. We also learned that this man lived near our house and had previously struggled with addiction and had gone through episodes of psychological breakdowns before. However, none of that explained where the blood on him had come from at that time, or what he intended to do if we had let him in. My name is Leon, but my friends call me Leo. I live in a small farming town in Texas, where the nearest city is about a 20-minute drive away. The story I'm about to share happened when I had just turned 18. At that time, I decided to head into town for dinner at a new sushi restaurant that had recently opened, which quickly became one of my favorite places. After dinner, I chose to visit my grandmother instead of heading straight home, where I lived alone. My grandmother lived on a farm on the outskirts of town, and getting to her house required taking a long dirt road that stretched for about half a mile. I arrived at her house around 9 p.m., and as I walked in, she greeted me warmly, along with my brother Sam, who lived with her after our grandfather passed away. I had been visiting her often since our grandfather's passing. I wanted to keep her company. One evening, Sam and I took our grandmother's dog out for a walk around the yard to let him do his business. It was around 10:30 p.m., and we found ourselves sitting outside, listening to music and chatting for a while. As time passed, I started feeling a bit cold, as it was East Texas, and the weather had been quite unpredictable lately, with hot days followed by near-freezing nights. We decided to head back inside, but just as we were about to do so, Sam suddenly noticed something moving near the metal shed, a few hundred yards from the house. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it because it was common to see raccoons and deer wandering around the yard. Besides, our grandmother's dog wasn't barking, which made me think it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Once we finally got back inside, our grandmother went to bed around 11 p.m. Sam and I took the opportunity to play some video games. As the clock ticked closer to 2:30 a.m., I realized I was quite tired and decided it was time to go home. I asked Sam to walk me to the door to make sure I got to my car safely, as I always felt a little paranoid, especially at night. He joked about it but agreed to come along. When I left the house, I turned off the lights and closed the door behind me. I felt a bit scared, as usual, because the truth is, whenever I drive alone at night, I always get anxious. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what triggered that feeling. Was it the fear of something bad happening, or perhaps the creatures hiding in the shadows? I just knew it was there, but I was getting sidetracked from the story. The truth is, I insisted that Sam walk me to the car, and eventually, he obliged. I got into my car, locked the doors, and as I was backing out, I noticed in the rearview mirror that the porch lights were going out. I drove home, which took about 10 minutes, and made myself some ice cream before settling down to watch YouTube videos. About 15 minutes later, I received a FaceTime call from Sam. The tone of his voice indicated that he was panicking. I asked him what was wrong, and after hesitating, he told me that after I left, he went back outside to listen to some music and sit on the porch. He had the music playing loudly on his phone, which usually masked any animal noises from the nearby woods. A few minutes into listening to the music, he heard what he thought was the sound of metal being struck. He quickly stopped the music to listen carefully. As he stood up and looked toward the boathouse, which was a few hundred yards away, he said he saw a faint light shining near it. But then it quickly went out. At that point, he started to feel scared, so he quietly returned inside and closed the door behind him. He ran to his room at the back of the house, grabbed our grandmother's revolver without thinking of waking her, and hurried back outside. He noticed the glow of the flashlight moving, but as soon as he spotted it, it disappeared. He crept to the edge of the concrete carport and looked into the boathouse, the revolver at his side. The only light illuminating the boathouse was the dim glow from their home. He tried to muster the most intimidating voice he could and shouted, "Who the hell is out there?" There was no immediate response, only a faint knock, which confirmed that someone was indeed there. Keep in mind that this was in the middle of the countryside, in a town with a population just over 1,000 people. The nearest houses across the lake were miles away from the main road. So, it was unlikely that a well-meaning person would just stumble upon my grandmother's house at that hour. Moreover, my grandmother had experienced issues with people snooping around the property in the past, so none of us took this lightly. I can't fathom why Sam didn't call the police, but it's worth noting that there was literally one cop in the entire town. And it was 3 a.m., meaning it would take at least 30 minutes for the cop to arrive anyway. Sam called out for the person to show himself, repeating the question over and over. He confessed to me later that he nearly wet his pants when a lanky figure emerged from the boat shed, holding a flashlight. Although Sam couldn't see any distinct features of the person, he could tell it was an older man, and it was no one we recognized, especially no one who should be in our boathouse at 3 a.m. He raised the revolver to point it at the man and shouted again, "Who the hell are you?" The man remained silent and began to walk slowly toward him. Sam cocked the revolver and gave the man a final warning. "I swear I'll shoot you. Who are you, and why are you here?" The man quickly raised his hands and said, Hey, calm down, man." His voice sounded ominous as he continued walking towards Sam. In light of the stranger advancing, Sam fired a single shot just above the man's head, which finally made him realize that Sam was serious. The guy quickly took off on foot down the driveway, and Sam yelled, "Next time, I won't miss." He then rushed inside to wake our grandmother, who somehow managed to sleep through all the commotion. She didn't seem concerned enough to call the police, but after hearing this, all I could think about were the man's true intentions. Was he just a drug addict snooping around to steal tools or money? Or did he have far more sinister motives? Another question that haunted me was how many times this had happened after my grandmother and brother went to bed, and we just didn't know about it. Had he been watching us all night? I also thought about what could have happened if my brother had turned off the lights and locked the doors behind me when I left. In the end, I realized how lucky I was that Sam was there to protect our grandmother. But this experience made me aware of the dangers that lurk in the night in our small town. I grew up in a small town in the UK where everyone knows each other, and secrets don't stay hidden for long. When I was 13, I became friends with a girl named Sarah, who lived in a house directly behind mine. We started hanging out after school. We didn't do much when we weren't at each other's houses. We would go to the local park or stroll around the street, talking about school events. Sarah smoked cigarettes, but I didn't because we were underage. She would take cigarettes from her dad or pick up used ones from the ground, which disgusted me in our neighborhood. We had a neighbor, whom I'll call Miriam to protect her privacy. Miriam was about 60 years old at the time and was known as the crazy cat lady. She lived alone with a bunch of cats, and many people in town avoided interacting with her because she was very unkempt and always smelled strange, like cat urine. While her cats were well taken care of, I couldn't understand why she had such a foul odor. Anyway, Miriam would always hang around me and Sarah, and I called Sarah Layla to protect her real identity. I would take the bus home from school, and we had to walk past Miriam's house to get to ours, as this was our usual route. Every time we passed by her house, Miriam would always stand at her garden gate and start a conversation with us. No matter how hard we tried to avoid her, she always found a way to keep us there. Whether it was through a comment or a question that annoyed me a little, because I just wanted to get home. Despite that, it didn't seem to bother Layla as much as it bothered me. She always engaged with her and stayed to chat. Sometimes when we were wandering around, Miriam would try to talk to us, especially on my behalf, which made me feel suffocated. Then I found out that Layla smoked. I don't know if it was because she smelled of cigarettes or not, but Layla admitted it when Miriam asked her about it. That day, she asked us to wait, then disappeared for a short while and came back with 2 cigarettes. She went to give me one, but I refused, then handed it to Layla and said to her with a smile, "Here you go." I felt incredibly uncomfortable, but I didn't want to show it. I didn't want to make them feel awkward or think anything wrong. Now, I'm not gay at all, but I knew that Miriam was, or at least that's what I had always heard. In the context of the situation, I wondered if she was planning something sinister. This would become clearer as the story progressed, but for a woman her age to offer cigarettes to a young girl to make her feel cool and special was inappropriate. Clearly, Miriam was not a well-meaning person. For me, at least, Layla accepted the cigarettes and kept chatting. After that, Miriam started giving Layla cigarettes every day after school. I told my friend that I thought it was weird, but she disagreed, insisting that Miriam was great because she was from the hippie generation, and told us she had smoked when she was a teenager too. I was not convinced at all, but I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want Layla to get into trouble with her parents. One weekend, it was late afternoon and we were wandering the neighborhood again when we passed by Miriam's house. She must have seen us from her living room window because she ran to the yard and then waved us over. I felt uncomfortable again because I hated being around her, but I had to follow Layla, who was given another cigarette. This time, Miriam gave Layla a lighter and asked her to smoke it while standing in the doorway. I looked around, but there was no one outside because it was winter, and the sky was very overcast. I thought Mariam was being way too hasty to let Layla smoke right in front of her, but I didn't want to leave my friend, so I stayed where I was. The woman asked us what we were going to do that day, and Layla replied that we might go into town to shop and then return to her house for dinner. Mariam nodded, then suddenly invited us to her house for orange juice. I felt very uneasy and didn't want to go inside. I realized that Layla didn't want to either, and we started exchanging glances, even though Layla was always the rebellious one. Mariam said, "Come on, I have fresh orange juice. This summer is unbearable. Come have a drink." I felt uncomfortable, so I spoke up and told her that we should go into town and that we didn't have much time left before our bus arrived, so it was better to head out right away. I then grabbed Layla's hand and pulled her away from there. After that, we didn't look back and walked in silence to the bus station. While I was there, I told Layla that Mariam was creepy and that I didn't feel good about her inviting us to her house. Fortunately, Layla agreed with me, at least at first. Later that day, when we were in Layla's room after returning from our shopping trip, she told me that Mariam probably didn't mean to be weird or have hidden bad intentions. At that point, I looked at her as if there were a horn growing out of her forehead. I said, "For Christ's sake, we're 13 and she's in her 60s. I told her there was no chance of that being a normal friendship. I told Layla that I didn't agree with her and that it was weird and irresponsible to give her cigarettes and now invite us for orange juice. That was something I couldn't ignore. Not only was it strange, but there was something about the situation that made me feel it wasn't right. I felt uncomfortable. I told Layla that there were a million reasons not to go into a stranger's house for any drinks. She could spike our drinks and kidnap us. She could have done that when I told her, but the rebellious Layla always wanted to contradict me. She told me that I was being paranoid and that I was unfair in my judgments of Mariam. She said something about not knowing if I was overprotective or biased, and she gave me a full lecture on how I shouldn't judge others based on their tastes or appearances. But my concern had nothing to do with that. It was about Mariam's behavior, which began to make me feel uncomfortable. However, unfortunately, I didn't want to push the matter further and let it pass, and I didn't talk about it again with that friend. The incident that caused the concrete veil in front of everyone's eyes to fall happened in early November. At around 5 p.m., our curfew was 7 p.m., and Layla and I were the same age, and our parents enforced almost the same rules on us by this time. It was about 4 p.m., but it was already dark. I was coming home from a friend's school, and as I was about to pass by Mariam's house, I saw Layla coming out of Mariam's house, smiling. I felt my heart freeze. I couldn't believe it. She must have closed her door quickly and ran towards me, greeted me, then turned to go to my house. I asked her what she was doing with Mariam, and she couldn't tell me. She just smiled, but I didn't think it was anything good. Despite that, even though I didn't know why, I knew something was wrong. The whole way home, I was thinking about everything that could have happened inside Mariam's house. She was speaking quickly, and her face was flushed. I asked her directly, "What happened? Why are you smiling?" But she didn't answer, so I let her go, and I certainly didn't expect to see her again that evening. When I got home, I decided to go to bed early, just because I was feeling so anxious. I was very angry with Layla for hanging out with Mariam after everything I had told her. But I was also angry with myself for not being able to put a stop to such things. The next day, Layla called me at school. Instead of asking me about how I was doing, she asked me what I thought was really going on between them. I told her I was really worried, and I could see the shock in her eyes. She said, Sorry, I shouldn't have gone over there. I promise I won't go again." She told me about how Mariam invited her to come over again, and she apologized for going out. She told me that Mariam took her by the hand and made her sit down. She made her tea and gave her sweets, then took her to the living room and asked her to stay longer. Mariam was bringing Layla sweets and started asking her about her friends, then asked her if she wanted to have another cigarette. I can't describe how shocked I was. I couldn't even speak, but I really wanted to hit Layla at that point. I felt offended by how she was treating my feelings. After that, Layla admitted to me that she was smoking with Mariam, and she told me she would try not to hang out with Mariam again. By the time Layla got us out of that, I realized I needed to talk to her mother. Layla's parents were always distant from her and didn't spend much time with her, so I knew I needed help. I thought about how they would react to Mariam and find out about it. After a little thought, I went to Layla's house and looked at her mother through her front window, but she wasn't home. So I decided to go back to my house and wait to see how things would go. Days went by, and then the news I had been waiting for came. One morning, after a week, Layla's dad came home, but he wasn't alone. He came with the police and went straight to Mariam's house. I ran a few streets behind them because I wanted to know what was going on. I felt happy to talk about it. Layla's parents had discovered everything, and they wanted to know more about Mariam. After a short while, I was able to see Mariam talking to the officer, realizing that the nightmare of her actions was beginning to unravel. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I couldn't move my feet. I just stood there watching her talk to the police. After that, the officer took Mariam into the car and drove her to detention. I sat on the side of the sidewalk and put my head in my arms, and I heard Layla's dad talking to the investigator. It was truly a painful experience, but in the end, it was comforting to be there. I felt a mix of fear and relief. The police left and went on their way after they finished everything. I didn't think Mariam would be as bad as we thought, but over time I realized she had some strange behaviors, especially after realizing she was offering cigarettes to Layla. I couldn't get over that. I can't tell you how Layla was affected by her experience with Mariam, but she was emotional, and I know she suffered severe trauma in her relationship with that woman. In the end, that experience made us better friends. We realized we always had to protect each other and be careful about who we were around. So, that was my experience with that woman, and I hope it's helpful. I grew up in a small town in Nebraska, and during the 18 years I spent there, only 2 major events occurred. The first, which might be considered the best thing, is that I wasn't born to be someone important, but for me, that meant something special. The second, which might be considered the worst thing, happened when Chris Baldwin set fire to his garage, which can be seen as the worst thing that happened in our town. This may not make sense to you now, but once you hear the story, I promise you'll understand it completely. It was a Sunday night, and I was a freshman in high school at the time. I was still at that age when my friends and I would go out biking at night. You know, it was fun and healthy, a way to get some exercise. That night, we were riding our bikes when we suddenly saw another kid from our class driving his car down the street at full speed. When we realized where he was headed, we all gasped in unison and said, "Oh my God, Chris's garage is on fire." At that moment, we all took off on our bikes toward the burning place, which was Chris Baldwin's garage. And when we got there, I already saw police and firefighters at the scene. They arrived within seconds. We tried to get closer, but an officer immediately told us to stay back. We thought we were already far enough away, so we were quite confused. However, we did exactly as we were told. That's when we started hearing all these bangs and crashes coming from the garage, while the firefighters were desperately trying to put out the flames. Suddenly, there were several explosions, and we all ran to hide. We had no idea what was happening, but we were really scared for a moment. I thought the Baldwin house was about to explode or something like that, and when we realized it, we all ran to hide until the next morning after the fire. Everyone at school was talking about it and waiting for Chris to tell them what happened, but he didn't show up to any classes. Rumors started spreading among the kids that paramedics were seen at the fire loading someone into an ambulance, so we assumed that Chris might have been injured in the fire. However, other witnesses claimed that Chris was not taken out of the house injured, but that his body was completely burned. On the other hand, some claimed he simply went to live with relatives because his house was reduced to ashes. Many stories began to emerge, but the truth would come later. The morning after the incident, authorities finally reported on the event. 3 generations had lived in that house, and Chris was one of the 4 children in the family, but nothing specific was known except for speculation. Logically, many other rumors started to circulate, and it wasn't until the next day that our high school principal called us all to a special meeting where we really got some concrete answers. I remember the whole school entered the gym, where the county sheriff and a few deputies stood, each with a very serious look on their faces. Once we all sat down, the principal began by saying that the county sheriff had something important to talk to us about, and as he stepped forward and removed his hat, I swear we heard a pin drop. We knew it would be something about the Baldwin family, but we weren't sure what exactly. I swear, I would never have guessed in a million years. I won't pretend that I can remember exactly what the man said, because all of this happened more than 20 years ago, but essentially it went like this. You've all heard about the fire at the Baldwin house, and I'm sure you've all heard about the tragic loss of life today. I'm sorry I have to be the one to tell you this, but Chris, your classmate, is the one who died. At that moment, we heard a collective gasp echo through the gym, and the sheriff paused for a second. Before continuing, he said they were still trying to figure out how the fire started, so he encouraged anyone with information about Chris to come forward. You didn't have to do that right then. You could call my office anytime, and we could have a more private conversation. But please, if anyone has anything to say or remembers any strange or unusual behavior from Chris in the days leading up to the fire, I implore you to come forward. That was the first indication we realized that something was truly wrong. I think they wanted to handle the whole situation discreetly, and then we fully understood why. Everyone's initial reaction was one of shock and deep sorrow. The kids were horrified at the death of one of their own in such a horrific way. But if the police had told us the real reason behind this terrible tragedy, I don't think people would have grieved as much. They would have been angry and perhaps even relieved that it had happened. It took several more days for the truth to emerge, and by that time, the town decided to place the blame on our parents. I remember there was a town meeting where my parents asked me to finish my homework before they returned home. But all I did was play video games for about 2 hours before they got back. I thought they would be angry because I hadn't done anything at all, but they weren't angry. Instead, they had those strange, sad looks on their faces, just like the ones they had when my grandfather died. Suddenly, they sat down with me in the TV room and asked me how much I knew about Chris. I didn't tell them much. I was just studying Spanish with him, but we never talked. Then they started asking me a bunch of other questions about whether Chris had been angry with me, or if I liked him, things like that. And in the end, I simply told them that it was clear they knew something about Chris, and they better tell me right away. I thought it was about his suicide. If that were the case, at that time, I was old enough to handle the truth, or so I thought. But that's not what happened. I was wrong because the truth about Chris's death was something that would take me years to fully grasp. In reality, Chris didn't commit suicide. He lost his life accidentally when his garage exploded while he was trying to make a bomb. Yes, that's how horrifying it was. He was making a prototype for a bomb he planned to use to blow up the school. When I heard that, I was completely shocked. I was terrified. It turned out that after conducting a lot of research and investigations into the cause of the fire in the garage, they realized that all the necessary elements for making a simple bomb similar to those used by Arab terrorists were present. However, they didn't realize what his plan was until they found Chris's journals, where the boy detailed everything he intended to do, when, and how. When this information was revealed, the entire town was left in complete shock. It was something no one expected and revealed a level of evil that no one had seen in Chris through his writings. It was also known that his goal was to kill some kids. He hated them deeply. However, it was not very clear whether he was a victim of bullying from those kids, as that was never revealed in his journal writings. Essentially, he talked there about the hatred he felt toward his classmates and school and his fantasies of blowing things up. So it was never known whether he sought revenge for something they did to him, or if he was just a cruel person, and that was it. But without a doubt, this is the most terrifying incident I have ever witnessed.